Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod here to talk about MSU's next opponent in the NCAA tournament, the overall number one seed, the Auburn Tigers, champions of the SEC. Before we start, a quick word of thanks to all our awesome supporters of the show on PayPal, Venmo, Patreon, Substack, and YouTube. To all of you, thank you so much for your support, the work we put in for you to give you the best MSU basketball content out there and the top 50 basketball podcasts in America. Without your help, this wouldn't be possible. So if you want to join all those awesome people, head on over to support page, go to tffinots.com/support. And remember, you can also go there to get your TFF iNuts or TIF Nuts logo apparel from Awesome Nudge Printing, just like I'm wearing right now. My Kelly Green quarter zip, their hoodies, everything is available there. You can just get that either through the link through our page or just go to nudgeprinting.com/TFFINOTS. Either way, gets you right to a page. And also, I did make an error in the Ole Miss post game where I said MSU won the fast break points 11-3, and I had it backwards, which actually makes a lot more sense because it was kind of hard for me to sort of square how they can have a edge in the fast break points, a big edge in the free throws, and then yet have a game that was only like a few points. So that it partly explains that. So I had that backwards. But anyway, let's get into talking about this Auburn matchup here in the Elite Eight. Tom is with an opportunity to get to his ninth Final Four in 30-year career. He's well, I guess we'll get into that in just a little bit. So it's a 5 o'clock game on Sunday. It's Auburn is 31-5 overall this year. They just beat Michigan by 13. It was a tight game for probably, what would you say, about 30 minutes or so.
Yep.
In the last 10 minutes, they just pulled away and just kind of crushed Michigan.
Yeah.
It was similar to kind of thing we saw what Michigan State did to Michigan. By the end, they had nothing left in the tank. And I think, we've been talking a lot that Danny Wolf just doesn't quite have enough for as much as he's asked to do. He's just not able to do it for 40 minutes, which is, maybe no knock against him for guys.
It's not a knock against him. It's the reality is that, this is well understood. It's kind of basic biology, right? Or physiology. A
Right.
bigger body typically, on average, is going to have a harder time with endurance. Like endurance runners, world-class endurance runners are not 7 feet tall typically, right?
No, they are not.
Or sprinters for that matter. It
Mm-hmm.
just it doesn't tend to go along with size to be optimal in those ways. And especially considering that he functions in part as a big man too.
Right.
Defensively,
Banging down there. Yeah.
he's
Right.
their best rebounder. He's their best shot blocker. So they ask him to do a lot that way. So there are frequently games where he's asked to bang in the post on defense, and then on offense, he's got to do everything, including running the show. So no, it's not an accident. I think it wasn't just him, but I think you saw him wear down in
Yeah.
those last 10 minutes. And that's not surprising. That was, the only blame you could assign Dusty May for that is, I suppose, in roster composition and putting that team together.
Sure.
They added Trey Donaldson, who was an effective player for them most of the year, but not, in my opinion, a point guard. And so they had this and they didn't have anybody behind him. So they
Mm-hmm.
had this big void that they were extremely lucky. I don't think anybody anticipated Wolf would be able to do what he did, even given the negatives, right? So if he
Right.
hadn't been that, boy, they really would have been up a creek. But anyway,
Yeah. Right. Well, we don't need to talk about Michigan more. Their season's done. Thanks to the hands of Auburn and SEC coach Bruce Pearl, who's been around the block a couple times. He's had a little stint in the Big Ten when he was a assistant coach at Iowa, and then
that's
he's kind
right.
of been at
And
Tennessee
and
and
was involved in one of the all-time great cheating scandals, and really one of the best. It was beautiful in a way. There was a kid, some of our older listeners will remember, a guy named Deion Thomas, who was a very good player at Illinois. Deion Thomas was a kid from Chicago who was a subject of a very intense recruiting battle between Illinois and Iowa. And by recruiting battle, I mean who was going to buy him, who was going to pay him
right.
more.
Mm-hmm.
And he opted to go to Illinois. And Bruce Pearl, who was dirty as the day is long as an assistant at Iowa anyway, he decides to try and entrap Deion Thomas by getting him to admit over the phone in a call that was recorded. And I I'm not certain. Been a long time. I'm not certain if it was even legal to record that call the way that he
Depends on the
did.
state, oftentimes, right?
It differs by state. Yes, the statutes differ as to what's permissible in terms of recording a phone call, and I'm not sure how that went, but he tried to. They tried to use it to get Illinois in trouble with the NCAA, which was the epitome of pot calling the kettle black. It was beautiful, but yeah, Bruce. He went on from there. I want to say, and I didn't look this up. I probably should have. I believe he was at Southern Indiana, a D2 school, had a very good run, might have even won a national title there. I don't recall. And that led to his career in the D1 ranks. Eventually, he was at Tennessee, which is where he had his only meeting with Tom Izzo and Michigan State,
Hmm.
interestingly, in the Elite Eight in 2010, where a Kalen Lucas less Michigan State team uh, beat them 70 to 69, and got a second straight trip to the Final Four. That's the only time these two guys have met. He was then fired by Tennessee for, wait for it, recruiting violations, and had to do some time in penance away from the game. I don't know if he had a show cause or not, but he did some time away. And then, of course, where is a guy with a track record like that going to get hired? The SEC. They welcome him back with open arms at Auburn because they don't care about any of that stuff.
Certainly not at
And
Auburn, right? Yeah.
and he's been successful. He's been to the only Final Four he's been to in his career came in 2019, the last time Michigan State was in a Final Four, where he took Auburn there, and they lost in the national semifinals to Virginia, while MSU was beaten by Texas Tech. So everything old is new again. Bruce Pearl and Tom Izzo for the second time. It's also worth mentioning a few other things. Um, MSU has only faced Auburn once, which is pretty remarkable to me when you think about, we're in this era where Michigan State's made the NCAA tournament 27 straight years. And not that Auburn's done that, but they've been in it a decent amount over that stretch. And no meetings there before this. You think about all the Feast Week tournaments. Now, they were both in Maui. Theoretically, they could have met in Maui this
Right.
year, but it didn't work out that way because Michigan State got beat by Memphis. Otherwise, they would have played Auburn in the championship game. Um, but they've only faced each other once over the entire history of the two schools. And that meeting came in the winter of 1989, the Judd Heathcote era, where Michigan State beat Auburn by 13 in, it was either a first or second round game, I can't remember which, of the late lamented Great Alaska Shootout,
Oh, yeah.
which MSU ended up winning by beating Kansas State and Lon Kruger in the title game. And that tournament was actually, I vividly remember it, that was really the first strong indication that Michigan State was ready to turn the corner, winning that tournament, because that was always a very strong field in those days.
Hmm.
And Michigan State winning it was, they ended up winning the Big Ten, went to the Sweet 16 later that season. That was the Steve Smith era. But that's the only meeting between the two schools. A few other interesting numbers I want to throw out before we get into the teeth of this. Tom Izzo, in his career, is, after last night, 10-0 versus SEC teams. Okay.
In the
So
tournament.
don't know. We'll see what that means.
Yeah.
Michigan State is a program, lifetime, 12-1 versus the SEC. I mentioned, I think it was last night, wasn't it? We talked
Yeah.
about the one, Irvin Johnson and company losing in the Elite Eight to Kentucky. That's the only time an SEC team has beaten Michigan State ever
Right.
in an NCAA
It's important to
tournament.
say yeah, right. And the 10-0 is only in the tournament. They've lost, obviously, regular.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
but probably
Yeah.
not that. I don't think that many. I mean, there's several to Kentucky in there. That's true.
Yeah. They lost to Alabama once, so that with
Yeah,
Seattle or
there,
something like
there
that.
are a
But yeah, right.
handful here and there, but the,
Portland.
the overall record is still very, very good against that league. And in the
Hmm.
tournament, it's almost spotless. Tom Izzo in Elite Eight games, 8-2, 80% win clip. And Tom Izzo in the second game of a weekend in the NCAA tournament lifetime, I believe I have this number right. Feel free to correct me if I'm off, listeners. I believe the number is 24-8, a 75% win clip.
Mm-hmm.
Those now, none of that necessarily has any direct bearing on what's going to happen tomorrow evening. We all understand that.
Sure.
But if I'm Bruce Pearl, I don't expect him to be focused on any of those numbers necessarily. But if he was, and certainly if I were an Auburn fan, I would be nervous about that. Because the picture that tells you, the picture that leaves us with, is a guy who usually wins these games. And I'll note, it's not as simple as, say, if you were looking at those numbers and they were posted by Coach K. Because Tom Izzo has not always had the higher seeded team. He has
Yeah.
not always had the favorite. And you know what? It really hasn't mattered. So, all things to keep in mind. I want to throw one more Bruce Pearl item out there. I've got so much to say about this man. But I'll do that, and then we'll turn to the nitty gritty.
Okay.
I have a bad habit that I'm going to admit to on this podcast, and that is I watch far more content from the field of 68 than any reasonable person should.
Why
Because
do you?
frankly,
Why do
you
you?
know why? Because I'm a junkie. And every once in a while, they have somebody who knows what they're talking about. It's rare. Robbie Hummel, we're a huge fan of at this podcast,
Yeah.
makes appearances, although less these days, as I think his broadcasting duties have increased since he does games for seemingly every network under the sun now, which is to their benefit. But, he would be an outlier. There are some others. Actually, last night, they had a four-man team, and one of them is a guy, Mike LaTulip, he was either a walk-on or a very deep reserve at Illinois back about, I want to say 10, 15 years ago, but I remember him.
Okay.
So he's a Big Ten guy. He knows what's up when he's talking about Michigan State and Tom Izzo. But I watched these other three clowns just drool their way through this thing where they flat out admitted they don't understand what's happening at Michigan State. I said, well, you can't, because Jeff Goodman's answer to everything that goes on in college basketball is you got to hit the portal. He's been screaming that for the last 3 weeks at Matt Painter. Matt Painter, guy went to the national title game last year, got to the Sweet 16 this year. This clown, this idiot, thinks he's going to tell him something. But anyway, to get back to the point, that was part of the point actually, but the big point is about my man Bruce Pearl. And I watched Battle of the Midwits. Jeff Goodman interviewing Bruce Pearl after their win. And he's talking to him about Michigan State. And Bruce Pearl says a few things which are fine. I saw the transcript of his press conference today. It's not as if he's dismissive of Michigan State. He's complimentary. I would expect him to be. But this was the thing that really stuck out to me. Pearl said, I'm not going to spend any time on them tonight. I'm going back to my hotel. I'm going to have one, by which he meant a drink, and then I'm going to bed. Now, I got into a discussion about this with somebody on the Spartan Mag board who felt that I was being unfair to Bruce Pearl because, of course, we have to assume he's had assistants game planning for Michigan State already, and I think that's a safe assumption. I'd be shocked. I mean, it would be coaching malpractice if they hadn't done something.
Well, absolutely. I mean, he would be that successful, not scouting, and.
But here's the deal. From the time their game ended till tip-off tomorrow, roughly 36 hours. That's all you got.
Not a lot of time.
36 hours. By the way, he said whether he's fibbing or not, we don't know, but he said at their press conference today he didn't have the game plan for Michigan State completely worked out yet. I read that comment as betraying something that, and this is not just me, this has generally been the word on Bruce Pearl. Kind of casual. And by that I mean casual at times when it comes to this kind of thing. He is going up against someone who, by any reasonable definition, is an absolute maniac when it comes to preparation, and who I've just cited all those numbers in the second game of a weekend in the NCAA tournament is, I think, when you factor in things like being an underdog in a lot of those games, is arguably the best coach in this situation in NCAA basketball history. There's a case to be made for it because he's not continually Coach K in it and rolling in
Right.
there with 7 McDonald's All-Americans.
Exactly.
It's always a talent. I think that bit gets overplayed, that Michigan State is somehow the equivalent of the team from Hoosiers. That's always untrue.
Yeah.
But they are not a team that just basically roll out the ball either, typically. And that's not their team this year. But that's the matchup. That's what Bruce Pearl is facing tomorrow. He's facing a maniac. He's facing a man who tells you he will not sleep, and whose assistants say and team says he doesn't sleep, and who's going to grind and work and watch film and do everything he can to figure out a way to beat Auburn over 36 hours. And that's
Mm-hmm.
who you're facing. And your answer to that is, I'm going to go back to the hotel, have a stiff one, and then off to bed. See you tomorrow. Hey, it's not a guarantee that Michigan State wins. Far from it. Auburn's a good enough team. They can roll out there and they can win this game. I'm just saying it, to me, it betrayed something that I think has long been a knock on Bruce Pearl, and a fair one. The man's won a lot of games. He's had a lot of success. He knows how to recruit. I think he knows how to evaluate talent. And I don't think he's a bad coach. But man, it usually takes more than that to take Tom Izzo out at this stage. Especially when Tom Izzo has a team like this one. That's the important part. When he's got a team that is dialed into him and the way he wants to do things, the way this team is, you are whistling past the graveyard, Chief. That's how I see it. So anyway, that's
Well,
that's my
Jimmy,
Bruce Pearl bit. He's something else, and we're gonna see what he is tomorrow
Jimmy
afternoon.
Buffett is very famously known for being very laid back with the songs and sort of hanging out and not working. But was behind the scenes like one of the hardest workers. And people would talk about how the fact the guy would never take vacation, he'd never rest,
Mm-hmm.
despite his songs being about like kicking back and relaxing on the beach
Right,
and things like that.
right.
And so I think someone could say, well, this is kind of like a shtick. Sort of his is like trying to be folksy, like, well, we're the underdog,
Yeah,
because
except
Tom's won a bunch, and I'm just going to kind of take it. I'll do what I can. We'll see how it goes.
yeah, not buying. This has long been a knock on him. This kind of thing. And again, it doesn't. I don't mean, some of the criticism you hear of guys like him or Calipari is, oh, they just roll the balls out. I don't
Right.
believe
Yeah. Yeah.
that's true. I don't want to go too far with this, but man, it was striking. It was striking to me. And maybe this is the result of following Michigan State for 30 years and you have a bias toward how things are done. But if that was my team and I heard my coach saying that, I'd be pissed. Dude, what the hell are
Yeah.
you doing? You are 40 minutes away from achieving, as Izzo says this stuff all the time. He was saying it last night. You're 40 minutes away from achieving a dream that will stay with you, his kids, I mean, for the rest of their lives. And your approach is, I'm gonna go tie one on and then off to dreamland. Are you kidding me? Even if it's shtick, it's stupid.
Well, that's where I would counter to with and in agreement with you, and this is one we've seen with Bruce Underwood as a good example, where it is true that, I mean, you can say things like, Greg Campy talking about how Izzo kind of like, sort of lays into the persona, makes it seem like he's not quite as sophisticated as he is. And obviously he is, on offense and things, but like with Underwood, he would say things that are windows into, there are times when you want to be a certain person, you want to deliver a message to your team, perhaps. like things are okay. We don't need to worry about things. And you'll see that Tom Izzo will do that all the time in his press conferences. But I think you get a window sometimes as to how someone really is, and we've seen that especially during times of stress, like after a loss, particularly. You saw that with Underwood, for instance. After that Big Ten tournament was a couple years ago, where he's like, yeah, we just didn't want to, we wanted rest for the NCAA tournament or something like that.
Right.
It was not a big deal to us. Uh, but I think that shows you a little bit of the character, and I think that's to your point. I think with this, it's probably one of those things that's like half true, right? Like he's not obviously doing nothing, but he's probably not pouring as much energy as you would expect for someone to achieve at the highest level at this
It
point.
speaks volumes. It
Yeah.
does. And I think about the other coaches that are alive in the Elite Eight. And maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so. I don't think you'd get that line out of any of the other seven. It
No.
says something. It
Yeah.
does. Now, I'm going to stress I'm not saying any of that guarantees a Michigan State win. Far from it.
Right.
Auburn is good enough that they can go out, even if there's been a half ass prep job done. They're good enough that they can go out and win. It's a very good team, as we're going to discuss. But man, I don't want a guy like that coaching my team. I don't.
Yeah.
Sorry. That again, maybe that's 30 years of Izzo derived bias. But I know what I want. I want a guy who wears it on his sleeve, how much it means to him, and who is giving you every ounce of sweat, literal and metaphorical, to get the job done. That's what I want.
The guy who says he's willing to die if he
Right.
die trying to get back there. Yeah.
Yep. And
Yeah.
here he is.
Here he
One
is.
year later.
All right. So let's talk about the Auburn Tigers here and just get into sort of the specific of their team. On offense, they're number 3 in Ken Palm. I mean, as you expect, the overall number 1 seed, they're going to be very good. So number 3 overall in Ken Palm on offense, very good for shooting 3. They're 55th. They're really good from twos. They're 32nd. They don't turn the ball over very much either, which number 7. So you put those all 3 together, that's going to look pretty good. And they had an anomalous game last night against Michigan where they turned the ball over 15 times, but that's not very typical for them. They're also a very good offensive rebounding team at 42nd. They're not very good at getting to the line, drawing fouls. They're 155th. And then when they do get there, they shoot okay. They're 73.3%, so 135th. So they're kind of like just average. So from an offense standpoint, they're very good. Again, these are things that you'd expect for a team that's going to be ranked this high. They're going to be good in offense and defense. You almost have to be.
Yeah, obviously, most things this team does well. They shoot the ball very well from 3 and from 2, from the floor, I mean, of course.
Right.
They get a lot of second shots, and they do a great job of valuing the ball. I I tend to look at their turnover performance last night as roughly equivalent to Michigan State's rebounding performance.
Yeah.
A
Right.
weird one-off that you would be shocked to see repeated. I do not think we're going to see 15 turnovers from Auburn. That the first half especially, both ways. You expect it with Michigan, but both
Right.
ways. It seemed like the ball was. I was texting with my sister, who's a U of M grad, and I said it seemed to me like the ball was just coated in Crisco for the first half because even plays that somehow didn't end up in a turnover should have.
Right.
Like it was a miracle when something happened relatively smoothly in that first half. Either way, whatever that was, it was some weird one off, I suspect. And I would be shocked to see it repeated. Just as I say, I would be shocked to see Michigan State rebound as poorly as they did against Ole Miss. I think sometimes in a one game scenario, weird things can happen. But on balance, they do a great job of taking care of it. And then when you add up, they get a good amount of second shots. They're not as good an offensive rebounding team as MSU is, but they're solid, 42nd.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then you add in how well they shoot the ball. Whew. That's a that's an offense that gets it done. The one weakness, as you said, they do not draw fouls very often and they don't shoot them. They're not terrible, but they're not great when they do
Yeah.
get there. It's kind of weird because when I think of this team, I think of them as kind of physical, especially inside, and that kind of team, right? But when
Yeah.
you really delve into how they play, their guards are much more jump shooters than they are downhill players. And so that alone is going to mean you're probably not getting to the line as much as another team would. And then even with their interior guys, we'll talk about Broome in a bit in detail. Really good player. I mean, one of the two front runners for National Player of the Year.
Right.
But despite his size, his scoring numbers, all of that, he's not really what I would describe as a great pure post player. If you watched that game last night, even his makes are kind of sloppy and rush. Like he's a very good offensive player overall. He can score in putbacks, a little bit of transition stuff. He can hit jump shots. He can play you face up. He can blow by you a little bit. But as a pure post player, I don't think that's his strength. So that means maybe he doesn't draw as many fouls as you might otherwise think a guy of his caliber at that position would draw. So that's the one, I think that's the one thing you got to hang your hat on is they don't get fouled a lot. And from there, if you can somehow, limit the second chances, make them take tough shots, maybe you got a chance.
Yeah.
But they're a very good offensive team for a reason.
Well, in defense, they're also extremely good. They're number 8 overall in KenPom. I think what's Michigan State, 5th or something? I think that was
Fourth.
they're like 4th. Okay, yeah. So they do a very good job defending the 3. They're 7th. We know Michigan State's first, so they keep their opponents.
MSU actually slipped to second.
Second now, okay.
After
that,
the Ole Miss
give it a
game.
couple, yeah. So there's still a sub 30% 3-point shooting defense. For twos, they're also very good. They're 34th. They have a really, really good block rate. They're 4th in the country in blocks, and they don't create a lot of turnovers. They're 165th in turnovers, 163rd in steals. So basically, it just kind of shows they're not gonna pressure and you can force a lot of live ball problems. They don't defensive rebound great. They're 159th, so that's pretty bad considering they're a Power 5 team. They also foul a ton, 310th, which I don't remember what Mississippi is, but I feel like that's close to what
they were like
Ole Miss.
314th. It's
Yeah,
right
I mean,
there.
I feel like it's almost like the same number. So that's their defensive profile. So again, they do some things really, really well, and then from a fouling standpoint and also from rebounding standpoint, not the best.
Yeah, it's funny because that's a great overall profile, right? 8th in the country, man. That's a strong defense, and they are. There's no getting around that. But it's really built off the way they limit shots. I mean, 7th against threes, 34th against twos, and again, that 2-point percentage is driven by the number 4 block rate. So they're really good at protecting the rim. All that's great. But unlike the offense where, their weakness is getting to the foul line and hitting them, but it's not like they're horrible there. It's just not nearly as strong as some of their other components. Here, they have 2 real weaknesses in my mind. The defensive rebounding at number 159, look, for a high major team, not a good number. It indicates, and it's not as bad as Ole Miss, so you never know how that's going to pan out in an actual game as we learn and relearn.
Absolutely.
But you're looking at this team based on their seasonal profile, that's a problem. But the fouling is a big problem. When you're at 310, it's just like Ole Miss, man. That tells the story. It's like they struggle to not put their hands on you. And it's one thing if they were playing, well, for example, playing Michigan. Michigan is not a team that I think of really as one that puts a lot of pressure on you on defense. That's not Michigan State. And Bruce Pearl talked about it today in his press conference that the biggest thing he's worried about, and he's correct in this, is Michigan State's guards turning the corner. Because when they turn the corner on you, what that means is they're headed to the rim. And that's where the trouble starts. And so I think he mentioned it, and it's absolutely, if I was doing this from an Auburn perspective, probably the number one key I would have would be defend without fouling, because that's
Right.
something they've really struggled to do. And now they're facing a team that very definitely is going to do everything they can to put you under pressure and force that. And you've already shown a propensity to do it anyway. So those two things are the chinks in the armor for Auburn on
Right.
defense.
And so the final bit of the puzzle is just from a team pace wise, they're 134th in overall pace. Average length of offensive possession is 131. So we'll call that middle of the road.
Yeah, much like Michigan State.
Yeah.
And look, Auburn is athletic as all get out. They are certainly capable. If you saw that game against Michigan, there was especially there was a lot of loose play both ways, I felt. And they're capable, but they're not a great transition team. So that's the one difference. The pace numbers and length of possession numbers look roughly similar, but they're not as given to going 94 feet.
All right. So let's talk about the lineup for the Tigers. And brought to you by the Brothers Adjust Your Gutters. It is raining a ton. I don't know what it's like over where you are, but it is running a ton here. And so make sure you have your gutters up working properly. The Brothers Adjust Your Gutters can take care of those gutters, any issues you have with them, whether it's just repairing them, replacing them, clean them out of all the debris, trees that might be growing there, like my gutters, or just upgrading them, putting new ones up, or maybe putting some downspouts on that work brother and push that water away from your foundation. Whether it's your home or your business or whatever else, if there's a gutter, they can take care of it. Contact the brothers today. You'll be very glad you did. You get 10% off as a listener of the show if you just go to our support page at thefinalfoursontheschedule.com. There you can find a link to either Kurt or Greg, depending what part of the state you live in. You can get your estimate and just mention Final Four and you get that discount. And they'll come out and take care of whatever needs to be taken care of. And they sponsor the player that Michigan State needs to keep in the gutter, which I'm sure will not be much of a surprise. We'll begin with Denver Jones, 6'4 senior, second year with Auburn right now. He transferred from FIU, Florida International. He averages a little under 11 points a game, shooting 44, 42, 91, and half of his shots are coming from behind the arc. He's fourth on the team in assists, with just a little under 3 a game. He's averaging a 2-to-1 assist to turnover ratio.
Yeah, good player, but the thing about Auburn's size and their starting lineup on the perimeter is big.
They are big,
but
yes.
but it's not like a Bryant. And I mean, this is one of the few areas I would ever dream of comparing the two. But what I mean by that is this: Auburn's guards, at least what I've seen, they don't really utilize that size as an advantage all that
Like
often in
Wisconsin?
terms of posting people up, getting, I mentioned already, they're not a team that really gets a ton done going to the basket. They're mostly jump shooters, and they're very good jump shooters. I mean, you look at Jones's shooting numbers, and they're fantastic. Michigan State would love guys
Oh,
that
yeah.
had those kind of numbers shooting the ball, but that's what he is. He's primarily a jump shooter. He's not a guy who's going to get a ton done at the rim. Decent ball handler, doesn't make a ton of mistakes, which really, again, yesterday notwithstanding, goes for their whole team. They're just not very turnover prone. So that's another nice element from their guard play.
And then we go to Chad Baker Bizarra, 6'7 senior. He was previously at San Diego State, Duquesne, JUCO. So he's in his second year with the Tigers. He's averaging 12.5 points a game on 46, 39, and 89 shooting. 3.1 rebounds a game. He's third in the team in assists. He's the top steal getter on the team. Averages almost 5 free throws a game. And so he's the guy who's going to obviously drive and sort of cause things to happen.
He's the
getting to the
exception.
line. Yeah,
Yep.
he's the exception to the rule here for this team. And at 6'7", he's not easy to stop from guard spot.
Yeah, good player, no doubt about that, and he should be because I think he's about 29. That's a slight exaggeration. I actually think he's 24, which I'm not
COVID.
kidding. I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
he's 23 or 24. Which, what are we doing? But regardless, he's going to play in that game. And regardless of his AARP status, he's going to be
Like the
tough
Dominican
to deal
baseball,
with.
Little League baseball team here.
Yeah, right, exactly. The 19-year-old player in the Little League World
Guy's got a
Series.
beard and he's like, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
12. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Uh, but he's good. No two ways about it. He's good. He's also very controversial, and I would imagine at least some of our listeners probably have not paid a great deal of attention to Auburn basketball. So I'll fill you in a little bit on this guy. He's in the middle of chaos frequently, and that's putting it mildly. This is a player who's been ejected from 2 games in the last 2 years. And it's worth noting, I think, what they were. The first was last year in their NCAA tournament loss to Yale. So big game, right?
Not a good time to get ejected.
The second was this year in one of the Alabama games. Also a big game. So he's shown a propensity to lose his head in stressful, big situations. Something to keep in mind. I think that cuts both ways, though, because if you're Michigan State, we know, I don't think I'm telling anybody something they don't realize. Michigan State likes to talk.
What?
They're guards, really. I don't think the big kids talk very much,
Yeah, just
but the
Trey and
guards talk.
Jeremy. Yeah.
Primarily Jeremy and Trey.
Yeah.
They can't get caught up in stupid stuff with Baker Mazara. Let him undo himself. That's what I would say. So that's the one thing I worry about, I guess, with him. Uh, he's shown a propensity to put himself in trouble. Don't feed into it, and don't play into that if you're Michigan State.
All right. Then we have 6'6" senior transfer from Georgia Tech, Miles Kelly. He's averaging 11.7 points a game, 3.5 rebounds a game, and also a very good shooter at 42, 39, and 92.
Yeah, another good shooter with some size, but again, not a guy who uh, is using that size. You're not talking about a Tanjay type who's going to maybe
Right.
bang you some in the post and go through you or over you. That's not what this team has with its length. I think it helps them defensively, not so much in terms of like getting in passing lanes and forcing turnovers, but rather just limiting shot quality that you might have. I think it's helpful for them there. Offensively, again, they're not the one maybe area you could see it making a difference is those guys are getting good looks, and they're big enough that they can sometimes even get a decent look even when it looks like they're being guarded.
Right. So then at the 4, we have National Player of the Year candidate John Broome, 6'10", 240-pound, fifth-year senior. He's in his third year at Auburn. He began at Morehead State. He is averaging 18 and a half points a game, 10.7 rebounds a game, 2.5 blocks a game, shooting 51, 27, and 59. So you can see his weaknesses are basically outside the layup area in the game. But he does get, as you mentioned before, he gets a lot of fouls. He gets 6 free throw attempts a game. The knock against him, or not knock, but I guess the thing that's been going on with him is he's sort of had these kind of random injuries. He's had a shoulder injury that he's been sort of dealing with. I think he had an ankle injury or some sort of
Yep, correct.
something in his leg. So he's not entirely himself, I guess, is that sort of the feel right now for how he's playing.
Yeah,
But he did well against Michigan,
he had a
22 and 16.
huge game against Michigan, 22 and 16. Yeah. Uh, you know what I would compare him to, and this is going to be unfair to him in a way because he's better than this suggests, but what he kind of reminds me of in some ways is a little bit of the version of, and this is just a comparison point that might make it helpful for MSU fans, a little bit of what Dawson Garcia was for quite a bit of last season. Remember when there was a period where he was still taking a lot of threes, but he was really struggling to hit them.
Right.
Well, that's Broome. He still takes enough of them. He's sub 30%. Now, the scary thing is it wouldn't shock you if he hit 3 triples in a game. He's
Right.
capable of
Exactly.
doing that.
Yeah.
But he hasn't been efficient with it. I say that's kind of damning with faint praise because the fact is I have a lot of respect for Dawson Garcia, but Broome is a much better player than Dawson Garcia.
Sure.
So, but it just stylistically, it kind of is a comparison point that I heard somebody mention, and I thought, yeah, there's probably something to that. Uh, he's a tough cover, and I think it's going to be challenging no matter what Michigan State does. I have a suspicion as to how they're going to approach this game, at least at the start defensively. We'll see if I'm right. We'll get into that when we get into the keys. Um, but he's a load. No two ways about it.
Yeah, and already you can see that this is not a stretch. I mean, he does have a little stretchability, but for the most part, it's not as dangerous a stretch as you at the previous three teams that Michigan State's been playing. Fifth will be Dylan Cardwell, 6'11", 250-pound, fifth-year senior. He's played his entire career at Auburn, one of the rare individuals in college basketball right now. He's averaging 5 points a game, a little under 5 rebounds a game, plays about 20 minutes, shoots 70% from the floor, but only 32% from the line. So he averages 1.5 blocks a game. So he's clearly a dunk, layup, and just kind of clean up the mess sort of offensive player.
I guess the one thought I have about these guys is if they're in traffic and they've got an easy one, but you're in position to foul them and you're in a spot where you can afford to take the foul, make it hard.
Exactly.
Make
Yeah.
these guys earn it if they're at the rim. That would be my advice because it's definitely Auburn is very much a feast or famine kind of team when it comes to the free throw line, and it's very stereotypical as to how that cuts. The guards, for the most part, shoot it incredibly well at the line, but they don't get
Right.
there all that much. The bigs really struggle, and they get there a decent amount.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely just see that from this team, they've got the obviously got some size in the perimeter, but like you mentioned, they don't play that way in some respects. They got a 6'10", 6'11" player, and then if you move to the bench, you're going to find there's not a whole lot of size there. So I mean,
Right.
it'll be it's going to be a team that Michigan State's going to obviously be able to play some size against, which they haven't been able to the first few games of this tournament. But you know, maybe you can take advantage of that. We'll see. So beginning with the reserves, Tahad Pettiford, 6'1", McDonald's All-American freshman, averages 11.5 points a game, plays 22 minutes, so kind of starters minutes, shoots 43, 38, and 80. He's top on the team with assists with 103 in 34 games and has a 2-to-1 assist to turnover ratio.
Yeah, and I think he's actually, you mentioned that you figured my choice to keep in the gutter is an obvious one. And I get that. But I actually gave a second's thought to this kid. And the reason I did is I think he's playing at a level that is even beyond those good seasonal numbers.
Mm-hmm.
He's playing really well. And he is, we talked about Padula and what a tough cover he was in last night's game because, in part, of how quickly he gets a shot off. This kid has a quick shot release too, and he's really quick. And I would describe him as more streaky than pure as a shooter. Um, but when he gets on a roll, as he did during the stretch of that game last night, look out because he'll pull up from 25 and hit it. So you've got to be conscious of that if you're MSU's backcourt. You can't relax. He's a really good player. I mean, he's a reserve in name only. You can make
Yeah.
a pretty good argument that he's their second best player.
Well, at this point of the season too, I mean, I think Thomas always just says by this point you're a sophomore. You know,
Yeah,
it's the way you play. If you've been playing
yeah.
obviously throughout the season, which he has.
He's, you know, if you compare him to Michigan State's top freshman, Jace Richardson, Jace is, I think, a more efficient player and a much steadier player. But this guy is one of those microwave types that
Mm-hmm.
you worry about. Even if you're 38 minutes deep in the game and he hasn't hurt you, you're still worried about what he could do in the last two.
Okay.
He's that kind of guy.
Next would be Chaney Johnson, 6'7", 225-pound senior. He came in from the JUCO ranks. He's averaging almost, a little over 9 points a game, almost 5 rebounds a game. Plays about 23 minutes. He's shooting 57, 31, and 71, and has just about 1 block a game as well.
Yeah, he's a productive, undersized post player, kind of shares minutes primarily with Cardwell, but he's a nice player. You know, does a number of different things. He's not going to be a star at any point, but he's going to make contributions across the board. You know, he's going to hit the glass. He's going to give you a little bit of scoring. He gives you some rim protection inside. So a nice complementary piece for them in their front court rotation.
And finally, we have Chris Moore, 6'6" senior in his fifth year. He also has been at Auburn the whole time. He's averaging 1.1 points a game, 1.6 rebounds a game, plays about 10 minutes, shooting 44, 19, and 67, obviously in very limited volume.
Right. Not much of a shooter. You know, it was interesting. Bruce Pearl's press conference today, he talked about maybe feeling compelled to go a little deeper. You can make a pretty good argument that in their 3 tournament games, their rotation has basically been 7 guys.
Sure.
And I think Moore probably is your 8th if they go that way. And I'm betting they do. I'm betting he sees, you know, at least a turn or two in this game. But um, depth is going to be an interesting question in this one
Right.
because Auburn has not been a team. Pearl spent a lot of time talking about it. He said over the course of his career, he's been a guy who's tended to play it a lot like Izzo has this year, where, you know, 9 or 10 guys all getting double digit minutes. But this team just hasn't been that way.
Yeah.
It's been a different deal. And he seems very conscious of it. He talked about the way, I'll give him this for all the shit I gave him at the outset about prep. He does seem to at least have a passing familiarity with how Michigan State has won games, because he did talk about the way that MSU has really pulled away from teams in the latter stages of games by virtue of just wearing them down. And that's something that he sees as a concern in this one. You know, he felt that, and I think rightly so, he felt that last night, you know, the matchup with Michigan, they were kind of similar in terms of their rotations. And so Auburn was able to win that war of attrition. Michigan wore down, they didn't. But against Michigan State, it's going to be a very different equation.
All right. So I assume that John Broome would be then the player that Michigan State needs to keep in the gutter.
Yeah, I mean, it would be really hard to go against the one of the top 2 contenders for National Player of the Year, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a weapon. I mean, that's we all understand that. Um, you know, he's a guy that uh does a lot of damage. He's a killer rebounder, as Michigan found out. He's a great shot blocker. Just does a lot of things. He's actually a pretty good passer too. He just does a lot of things well. I think the key for Michigan State is, as usual with guys like this who are in this category, you want to make him work and you want to make him as inefficient as possible because you're not going to shut him down.
Okay. And then moving on then to Who Cleans the Glass Best, brought to you by the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. For Michigan State, we're to figure out who we think is going to clean the glass best. But for you, dear listener, if you're in the Grand Rapids area or the greater Grand Rapids area, you can contact the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. They'll take care of your windows. They'll do some power wash in your house. Whatever needs to be done, they'll get up and get on the ladders and get it done. They'll go in your house. They'll do the interior part of your windows, your screens, your windowsills, the blinds, all the stuff really you're not going to do yourself. So have them do it. They do fantastic work, very good pricing. They did our house, and I mean, our screens have, I didn't realize how dirty our screens were until we had those cleaned. I don't know how often you clean yours, Rod, but it's not something I ever think about. I hardly even think about cleaning the windows, and then you realize how dirty they are. If you wear glasses a lot, like I do, you realize after a while that they get really dirty, and you just don't notice because it's sort of like the frog boiling in the pot, slowly boiling in the pot. That it gets worse and worse until you realize once you clean it, like, oh, I should have done that a long time ago. So
We are largely screenless, actually,
are you?
because we have an old house that did not have air conditioning when we bought it. So
Oh,
we were able to install a system for the first floor, but for the second floor where the screens would be, where they are, we needed to use window air conditioners. So I've got a
oh,
bunch of window air conditioners and thus no screens.
yeah. My foster son dropped one of his out his window. He did not install it
Oh,
properly.
don't tell me that. Actually, I screw them in every year. So
Yes, but it's always good to have a friend helping you put them in because otherwise you might drop it out the window before you get it
I
screwed in.
I do.
Well, he learned that lesson, let me tell you.
Yeah.
Uh,
I
but you know,
always I'll tell you there. I hate hearing that because that is something in my younger days when I was less diligent about doing things like say screwing one into the frame.
uh-huh.
And I just kind of had it hanging there. I would occasionally, when I let myself think about it, would worry about the thing falling.
Oh
So
yeah,
that's terrible. How high up was he?
yeah. It's just, I mean, it just like it was up.
Second
Might have
story.
actually. I think it was actually the first story, so it just fell like
Okay.
6 feet or something. So it wasn't like just completely
No chance of killing
destroyed.
anybody.
No, I mean in
Yeah.
his house, there's the only thing he's going to kill is maybe a squirrel eating a walnut. I mean, there's not
Right.
much around his house.
Right.
Which talk about some gutters that are messed up where you have all kind full of walnuts. That's a problem. So anyway, get a hold of the squeegee squad at Grand Rapids. They can take care of all that stuff. They're not going to they're not going to put, you install your air conditioners though. I don't think, but you can ask them. That you get 15% off. You mentioned Final Four when you get your estimate. You can get that, of course, at our support page. The Final Four is on the schedule.com/support. All right. So you have already won this season. So anytime I lose, I have to put on the basketball in my head. I had a pretty good run. I avoided it for the first couple rounds of the tournament, but I had to wear it last night. It was painfully hot. So I'm
Was
hoping
that
to avoid that again
18,
this time.
18-12, 17-12?
18-12.
18-12.
18-12 is yeah. So with
Okay.
hopefully 3 games
Three
remaining,
games left. Yeah.
which means I cannot catch you. So I think you get to pick
All
first this
right.
time.
I'm going back to the well, even though he's on a negative heater of a couple games here.
Yeah.
I'm going with Jackson Kohler. I think this is the first time in this tournament that Michigan State has actually faced a conventional team.
I was gonna say a traditional sort of
It's
lineup.
the
Yeah.
best team they've faced, obviously, but it's by far the most conventional team. And that should cut to Jax's advantage, at least in terms of how many minutes he's out there.
Yeah. Well, and you wonder too from a rebounding perspective if I mean completely annihilated Bryant, and that was partly because I think they just wore him down in the game. But I wonder if because they haven't been able to play sort of their typical lineups, if that's hurt their rebounding too, to some extent. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's just the nature of the. I mean, Ole Miss I think just playing harder, and they were going after this 50. They got the 50-50 balls and just played better. So I'll obviously go with Cooper as my second pick, who's in the tournament much like it was 2 years ago, and even last year. Just he because he plays good defense as a big, he's just going to play more minutes. And that when it's valued most by Izzo, when it comes to tournament time, every possession is important. You can't experiment and tinker as much as you can during the regular season. So he's
You,
going to
look,
get more minutes.
you can make an argument for I'd say the last 3 weeks.
Yeah,
Carson
absolutely.
Cooper's probably been every bit the rebounder Jackson Kohler's been.
Yeah, I would say that's true. I would say that Kohler is still better offensively, but no, I mean, that doesn't mean Cooper doesn't get offensive rebounds. He certainly does. Like that big, huge one in the end of the first half off the missed free throw by, I think it was Jeremy, and he tipped it
Mm-hmm.
back and to
That's right.
Jaden. Jaden
Huge,
tossed it. Yeah, and that
huge.
got a big three out of that. All right, so I think I'd be remiss to go with Carr. I mean, I think you go with Richardson here too. Either one is probably fine. The advantage of Richardson, he's going to play probably a little more minutes, but Carr certainly he's taken on an expanded role in this tournament. There's no reason to think that he's not going to in this game either, with a lot of size and
Yeah.
athleticism. I think you're going to want him on the court as much as you can, squeeze out of him.
Yeah. So that leaves Richardson for me as my fourth pick. He had another good game last night. He had 6, I believe, which was
Yeah.
second on the team. So I'm going to go with Jace.
Yeah, this is actually a pretty good competition for the rebounding because it could certainly go either way. You could see Richardson having more than Carr or vice versa, and Kohler and
Yeah.
Cooper, based on minute allocation.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting. So I'll kind of be pins and needles. I mean, obviously, I care most about whether Michigan State wins or not. So anyway, all right. So let's get on to the keys of the game brought to you by Nudge Printing. As I mentioned before, you can get all your Tiff Knots logo apparel now at Nudge Printing, and that also includes little stickers. Super high quality. We were on the live stream last night. A number of people have Nudge stuff. They love it. We had someone else did the live stream before talking about how that she bought it for a friend and then didn't give it to him because she liked it too much. So great stuff. Super high quality. Again, I don't recommend that you buy things for people and then not give it to them. but just buy two. So you can head on over to Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com. If you want to get our apparel, you can find that at either the link through our support page, which is easy, or just put in nudgeprinting.com/TFFINOTS. You can make an order with our stuff and other stuff from Gabe and Brittany, so it doesn't matter. So just head on over today. You get that stuff, and it's get 20% off if you type in Final Four as one word and checkout. And do it today. You'll be glad you did. I love the Nudge stuff. And again, the one knock against Nudge is it's really high quality. It lasts a long time. So, you know, you can only buy so much of it. Although you can buy for your friends. And this time I actually give it to them. All right. So the first key to the game, which is always a key somewhere and number one here is boards. This is one that Michigan State had an apparent advantage, pretty significant advantage against Ole Miss, and it just did not materialize. It was kind of a very strange outing for Michigan State, how bad they were on the offensive side. They're pretty good defensively, but not great. I mean, they still gave up quite a few offensive rebounds on that at that end as well to a team that doesn't offensive rebound well. So in a game like this, we have a team that's so explosive offensively and is going to shoot well. You have to maximize the opportunities to score, and of course, one of them is you maximize your opportunities with offensively and minimize theirs by being good defensively.
Yeah, the battle between Auburn's offensive rebounding, Michigan State's defensive rebounding should more or less cancel out. Auburn's a very good offensive rebounding team. Michigan State is an elite defensive rebounding team. Now, having said that, Auburn is big, and Auburn is, you saw it in the Michigan game, and Michigan has a problem with its defensive rebounding. They have all year, so it's not a surprise it went that way, but Auburn was just tattooing them on its offensive glass. Michigan State's got to hold up there the way we would expect. You know, what you have to hope for is that Michigan State being able to get back to its more normal kind of rotation and normal allotment of playing time. Izzo actually said today he's planning on both Zapala and Book playing in this game. And that makes some sense to me. I can see that. Zapala for sure. I suspect Zapala will start.
I would think so. Back to the usual starting lineup.
Yeah, I would think so. And, you know, Book getting some minutes, we'll see how that goes, but you can see the rationale for it at least. They got to hold up there. That's obvious. Where there's an edge here, though, is at the other end. Michigan State is a very, very good offensive rebounding team, and Auburn is a thoroughly mediocre defensive rebounding team. And there's a reason for that. Auburn plays to block shots, basically, on defense. Number 4 in the country in block rate. What goes along with that is that you take a lot of risks typically, and if you don't get the block, you take yourself out of position. We saw Michigan State do that a handful of times last night. I can think about a play fairly late where Cohen Carr went for a shot block, didn't get it, his body was taken out of position, and the smallest guy on the floor, Padula, is there for a cleanup and a putback. You know, that's the kind of stuff that happens when you play that way. And Auburn is vulnerable. We said all the same things before the Ole Miss game and got none of it.
The Tifnats curse was in full effect.
I want to believe, and I suspect that was a one-off.
Yeah.
And that we will see things getting back to normal in this game. The fact that Auburn is big does not worry me particularly because I've seen Michigan State hammer big teams before. That their size doesn't mean that they're going to keep Michigan State off the glass if Michigan State is doing what they're capable of doing. But this needs to be somehow, some way, Michigan State got to the finish line despite a miserable defensive rebounding and offensive rebounding performance against Ole Miss. I don't know if I believe that can happen against this bunch. So I think Michigan State's got to be good here.
Right. Michigan State is a very good block team as well, but they seem to be pretty good at rebounding as well. I mean,
they don't take, they're not, they don't.
Is it a different type of blocks?
Yes. And, you know, Broome's an example. Okay. Guy gets 2.5 blocks per game, but typically the guys who do that, who post numbers like that, are doing that in ways that they're hunting for them. They take chances, they take risks, they get themselves out of position by doing that. For the most part, I just cited an example where Michigan State did it last night, but that's a
Right.
rarity. Michigan State typically, if you think about where their shot blocks come from, oftentimes it's man on man, right? It's not
Yeah.
weak side help coming and somebody flying at the ball. It's Carson Cooper staying up straight, or maybe Jackson Kohler coming from the side or behind a guy, you know, or
Yeah.
Jeremy Fears rising up at the rim to take
Yeah.
somebody out. Michigan State's shot blocking is extremely balanced. And I think part of that is because it comes within the flow of their defense. They don't take those kind of risks. And that's the thing. We talked about this the other day, how about 10 years ago, you definitely saw Michigan State having a shift of sorts in its philosophy and much more of an emphasis on rim protection than there ever had been previously. But
Right.
even with that, they typically have been responsible, by which I mean they're getting that rim protection without taking unnecessary risks. I think Auburn is more of a risk-taking defense. And that's part of it's not the only reason they struggle with defensive rebounding, but it's definitely part of it, in my opinion, is their risk-taking.
Yeah, I think a lot of the blocks Michigan State has, you almost don't even realize they're blocks, right? Or they're not the spectacular hitting into the
They're
fourth
not putting
row
it into
of
the
stands.
ninth row. Yeah.
Yeah, right. It makes a big yeah. Outside of the ones where they run people down on the, which is always impressive. All right, so the second key to the game is the free throw line. Obviously, Michigan State is pretty good at getting to the line, not quite as prolific as they were earlier in the season. They've been very good shooting free throws for the most part. There have been some times they've not been quite as good, but they were very good last game, and I think the game before that against New Mexico as well. Uh, so, and Auburn fouls a lot. So this, is, I mean, against really good teams, you have to maximize who you are, and this is another way Michigan State can maximize a way of scoring points.
Here's the deal. Auburn shoots the ball extremely well, and they limit other teams shooting extremely well. That's why they're where they are. That's why
Right.
they're one seed. Simple as that.
Exactly. Yep.
So when you look at that and you say, all right, how do we beat that? You've got to find ways to win in other areas. Now, I happen to think, Michigan State is a reasonably good team from two at both ends. They're an outstanding elite team defending the three. It gets talked about into the ground, their 3-point shooting on offense, but I saw a stat over the last 6 games, I think they're at 37%. Now that's
Yeah.
cherry picking. I understand that, but I also think it's fair to say we've talked about it. This is not a 31% team right now.
Right.
It's a little better than that, but any way you want to slice it, Auburn has an advantage shooting the ball and limiting the other team's shot success. They just do. So how do you make up for that? Well, one of the ways you make up for that is this area. Auburn fouls a ton. Period. End of story. On the season. Doesn't mean they will Sunday, but they do on average on the season. Michigan State draws a lot of fouls consistently. That is a combination that you would be very disappointed if you're Michigan State and you're not getting 20 plus free throw attempts in this game. And then the next step is you got to hit those. It was a
Yeah, obviously.
huge factor against Ole Miss, right? That they got
Yeah.
back on the beam and started draining free throws. Need to do that again. Both parts of the equation. Get there and then make them. At the other end, they match up pretty well. Auburn's very middle of the pack nationally in drawing fouls. Michigan State, very middle of the pack in terms of committing them. So that should cancel out. You should
Right.
have an advantage for Michigan State in this area. The question is, do you end up with that advantage you should have on paper, at least? And how big is it?
Do you see a reason to be concerned if you're watching the game and Michigan State's having trouble driving the ball? Because they're not going to get, you're not going to draw fouls if you're shooting jump
Sure.
shots all game.
Sure.
Like,
Yeah.
let's say they
I
go in
mean,
the inside a couple times, they get blocked,
you could,
the first 3, 4 layups, and then they just sort of, you could see them getting
but you
skittish and not going in.
can't do it.
No,
Can't do it.
I understand.
Even if that happens, you've got to keep attacking. You have to. It is a huge part of this game, just as it was in the last game. And you saw the game open up when Michigan State
Right.
started to. Now, I will say it's a completely different kind of defensive challenge that Auburn poses because Auburn is not a ball pressure defense, like at all. It's not a key to what they do. So they're not going to be out there throwing the stuff that Ole Miss did, the hard doubling on, hard hedges where they're trying to ice ball screens or, you know, getting aggressive with their trapping when the ball, trying to get the ball to go baseline and then applying traps down there. That's not
Right.
Auburn really. So it's going to be a different kind of challenge, but the bottom line is still the same. You got to get to the basket. Yes, the number 4 block rate team in the country is going to pose some issues for you at the rim when you're trying to finish. But, the old adage still holds true. Best way to deal with a shot blocker, go through him.
Hmm.
And so
Right.
Michigan State, even if they get some shots blocked early, cannot shy away from that. They got to keep the pedal to the metal, keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it, with the thought that eventually you're either going to start converting, you're going to start getting contact, or both.
All right. So third key of the game is a transition game. As I mentioned before, Michigan State did not do a good job in the transition game against Ole Miss. Of course, Ole Miss was, had everyone back. They did everything they could to prevent that. Uh, Auburn, I haven't watched a whole lot of this, but it looked like there were opportunities against them yesterday, at least when they played Michigan, from a transition standpoint. So, and then I guess the one equivalent in the SEC would be Florida, that plays similar to Michigan State. They've had an edge against Auburn. So I don't know. I mean, this is something that, I mean, we talk about free throws one way, obviously transition, trying to get points before the half court defense is set, especially against a team like Auburn.
Yeah, I mentioned Florida in the notes because they're the one team on Auburn's schedule that, in transition terms, is most like Michigan State. In fact, they're almost dead even with Michigan State on the year in average transition points per game. And when they matched up, they only played once, Auburn and Florida. Florida had a 14-3 fast break point edge, and it was a 9-point win, so it was pretty important.
Yeah.
That and what I saw last night against a Michigan team that, as we know, also tries to play fast. They're just not as efficient as Michigan State, but they do try to run. I thought Auburn was loose defensively at times, really loose. And if they're loose again, well, that's going to be a problem for them because Michigan State will punish it. Now, that equation starts with Michigan State controlling the defensive glass. If Auburn is getting second chances, going to be very hard to get the running game ramped up the way you want it. You don't expect that Auburn's going to give up many loose or live ball turnovers. So that's probably not a way that Michigan State can get the running game cranked. It's primarily going to be off made baskets where they're running the blitz counter break or off defensive rebounding. And so that's got to be there. But it's similar to the Ole Miss game in that I look at it and think, can you get to double digits? And I don't know, frankly, you know, as opposed to Ole Miss, I've got a little less confidence in Auburn being totally dialed in to dealing with Michigan State's break. I think there may
Yeah.
be more opportunities in this one. So we'll see. But one way or the other, I think it's important. Again, we talk about Auburn's strengths are that, possession to possession, half court stuff at both ends. So if you're going to beat them, I think you got to make up for that in these other areas. Transition basketball, getting to the line, second chance points. It's all the, I hate to make a direct football analogy, but the kind of the special team stuff,
Yeah.
the hidden yards, we'll call it the hidden points.
When my wife and I play cribbage, I call them the special teams. I don't even know what the name is. The pre-play. I don't know if you ever play cribbage, but I don't know what to call it except special teams. You score points. So I use football analogies in for the wrong games entirely. So, fourth key to the game is first half. Michigan State has not been good in the first half. Now, I think people take this a little too far. It is true in the last probably 10 or 11 games they trailed at halftime. probably more than they've been leading at halftime, and they've won almost all those games. But most of the season that has not been an issue. I mean, it's not, there are plenty of games this year where they were up by, double digits or whatever at halftime. So it's just been sort of a recent phenomenon that and what I was pointing out is that they've had trouble with just being sort of executing properly in the half court. We're just like turning the ball over. It's almost like they're just too juiced the last few
Yeah.
games. I don't know if
I think
that's really true or what.
there's some of that. They admit Cohen Carr admitted to that
Yeah,
for
it's,
one
and I think, and
yesterday.
it's funny. They were talking about how good he was, and I think that's true. But I felt like early in that game, people were blowing by him pretty easily,
Yep.
and I think that was probably him just sort of being almost like overcommitting and just trying to get on, just being a little too active. I don't know, too aggressive.
Yeah. Regardless, I do think this. It's great that Michigan State has 8 games where they've come back to win from a deficit of 10 or more. That's most in the country. That's fantastic. But you are playing with fire.
Yes, exactly.
And from this point forward, pretty good odds that Michigan State is going to be the underdog in every game they play, whenever that the ride ends.
Mm-hmm.
So you're facing better opponents. And no disrespect to Oregon or Purdue or Illinois or Michigan. Auburn is not those teams. They are a better team than those teams. So I don't think you can afford to get yourself in a hole. Now, Auburn's had their own problems in this tournament with that. They have not been able to get off to good starts either. I mean, Christ, they were in the second half, they were down 9 to Michigan.
Right.
So they've had their own. It's funny. Somebody posted this, and I hadn't realized it. They trailed by 9, the exact same score at pretty much exactly the same point in the game as Michigan State did yesterday. So Auburn's comeback started right around the same point and from the same kind of deficit as MSU's did. So I thought that was interesting. But I don't think, I'm sure Bruce Pearl is saying exactly the same thing. We can't afford to get off to a bad start. But given that we're a Michigan State podcast and we look at this through green and white lenses, it's MSU that we're worried about. They've got to get off to a quality start. Doesn't mean they need to have a 15-point lead early, but they've got to be in the game. I don't think you want to be in a position where you're down 10 points early to Auburn, because the problem is with this opponent, as opposed to most of the other ones MSU's faced, they might just be able to pull away from you.
Right. Exactly.
Or at
It might be
least give
15,
at
20
least give you
points
the
before you know it.
Heisman. At
Yeah.
least give you the Heisman and just kind of keep you there.
Yeah. Of course, the obvious bad news is if you're really good at coming back from 10 points down, it means that you're 10 points down way too often. Right. And
Right. You've
it's like
played
the joke in,
badly early in games.
yeah.
And, I do think, look, there are positive aspects to it, of course. It's a sign of MSU's resiliency. It's a sign of Michigan State being able to adjust in games. So there's a lot of good to that. Don't get me wrong. I just think we're at the point in the season now where the caliber of opponent you're facing dictates you not getting in those positions to begin with, because it might be a bridge too far
Yeah.
against teams of this caliber.
We joke in my profession, anesthesia, that if you're, someone who is really an anesthesiologist who's really, really good at emergency cricothyrotomies, which is basically if you can't you can't put an airway in someone and they're not breathing properly, and so that you can do an emergency where you put a needle into their trachea so you can breathe from. But if you're really good at that, that means you're having that situation too much, and that's
Right.
you don't want
Right.
someone who's an expert at that sort of problem.
Absolutely.
It means
Yeah.
your other parts are not you're not
If
skilled
some
enough.
if you're getting bailed out, it begs the question, why are you in the position of needing to be?
Exactly. Precisely.
Yeah.
All right. So the fifth key to the game is to guard the arc. As I was going through the numbers, especially the 3 guards outside. I mean, fantastic. All 40% shooters from 3. They even got a guy on the bench who's almost 40%. So this is a team that can just kill you from out there. So Michigan State's faced a lot of these teams. Usually it's been pretty good. Wisconsin game is the last time they really struggled. You could even argue a little bit maybe Mississippi, but that was only kind of late in the game when it mattered.
Those
Because
aren't
mainly
even
just kind of
those
one
aren't
guy.
even struggles though, man. They're not. Nobody's gone off. When we're saying, oh, it was a poor game defensively, the other team shot 35% from three. That's not spectacular. That's good. It's not great. And so we got to keep it in perspective. Michigan State is the number 2 team in the country against threes for a reason.
Yeah.
Now, in fairness to Auburn, they're not Wisconsin, they're not Illinois. They're very much middle of the pack in terms of attempting threes as part of their offense. So it's not as if we're saying, man, these guys drill it from there and they're going to put up 30 of them. That's not Auburn. But I think if you look historically, and I'm limited to say the last 8-10 years, when Michigan State faces a team like this, and I always go back, the kind of challenge that this team presents resembles some Purdue teams that we've seen in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I go back to the classic example to me
Isaac
was
Haas.
the Purdue team in 2018, where they had Isaac Haas, right, surrounded by everybody else was a shooter.
Yeah.
And Tom Izzo dealt with that by saying, all right, Haas, you're going one-on-one the whole day, and you get what you get, but we're not giving up clean looks from three. And it was just good enough to win that game. Didn't shut Purdue down, but it was just good enough to put MSU in position to win it, and win it they did. Similar scenario here. I don't think you're going to shut Auburn down, but I think your trade-off is we load up on the perimeter. Those guys do not get clean looks. And we let Broome, at least for a while, go one-on-one in the post. And is there a dangerous element to that? Yeah, but when you're facing a really good offensive team, this is the standard. You have to pick something because you can't take everything away. So I think what they're going to do is they're going to choose to emphasize limiting the three. And they're going to let Broome operate. I mentioned Broome's a really good player. I mean, that's stating the obvious. But I don't think he's a dominant low post player. I think Michigan State can hang in there against him. The other thing that helps is Michigan State's got a bunch of fouls that they can use.
Sure.
Against that guy,
Tito
right?
Booker in there. Yeah.
And he's sub 60% from the line.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I was saying earlier. Like if he's on the blocks and he's in a situation where he's got, he's going to convert, he's going to get a layup or a dunk. If you don't foul him, put him on his ass.
Yeah.
Make him earn him from the line. But I think that's what we're going to see. And I think where you get into trouble against this team is if they're going off from three, because then that's going to eventually open things up for Broome too, when you've got to counter that.
Yeah.
And then you're reeling, right? So I think that's how I expect Michigan State to start this game. And I think that's what they want to do. Get out on the three, load up, play a higher line, going over the top of screening action, and try to limit what they can do from out there. And then you play it from that starting point.
Well, for those who listen to our podcast, the audio version, the great OG Mike Garland. There's a clip from him right at the beginning where he says, "You can't trade twos for threes. You're going to lose coming down the stretch. You're going to lose." He gave so.
Yeah.
So anyway, the point here.
Let's look at that. Let's look at that in that kind of context. We know it's always possible for any game to be an outlier, but the expectation in this game would be Michigan State's probably not going to go out and bust 10 threes
right
on Auburn, right? It would be great if it happens, but we don't expect that. So Michigan State scoring is primarily going to come in twos. Hopefully a lot at the line, a lot of penetration, guards getting to the rim and converting, maybe some putbacks. That's what you expect. Transition, layups or dunks. That's what you expect. If Auburn's getting a bunch of threes countering that, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
So yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
This kind of brings me to one of the questions I had, after watching that game. I only watched the second half because we were recording the first half, but with Michigan and Auburn, the both teams came out undisciplined, or at least I don't know if undisciplined is the right word. Maybe unfocused, maybe
Sloppy,
too loose.
really, really sloppy and
Like my
loose.
wife has
Yeah.
said, yeah, like first time she's like, these guys at Auburn were just doing these behind the back passes and all these crazy things
Yes.
that were unnecessary, and they just were just
Yep.
like tossing into the stands. And this kind of goes a little bit back to Bruce Pearl, maybe. Is it possible that I mean, you definitely don't want to be too tight for a game like this. It's a big game. Obviously, you make the Final Four, whatever. You're in the Sweet 16, this situation. But you also don't want to be unfocused and undisciplined and sort of not dialed in. Like I felt like with Mississippi that they definitely got the word all week. We have got to rebound. We have got to get every loose ball. I mean, we got to
Yeah.
play tough. And they came out, they were absolutely all that. I mean, there's no question about that. They were focused, they were locked in. And then, you've got a turnaround of, like, as you mentioned, like what, 36 hours or something like that for Auburn to get a new message. And that I mean, they're going to have to focus and not just play too loose with it. I don't know. I mean, I guess I just feel like Michigan State's approach to the game on Friday night was better than Auburn's and Michigan's for that matter. I mean, I think Michigan was also kind of like, I don't know, they were just Michigan. Do you, I kind of feel like that's just sort of like that. I don't know. It's an edge of some sort. I don't know what you call it. It's like an X factor or something, but it's that they're going to be more focused and disciplined in the right way where I would not expect it as much from Auburn just because of the way they approached the last game. Now, kids are, and I think someone on the Magboard made a great point. There's you might be great one game, the next game the kids look, not great in certain aspects of the game. So just because you do something one game, there's no reason to expect they're going to be the same the next time. But anyway, I guess that's just my
Well,
sort of gestalt
but
feeling of
on
the
on that
teams.
last point, I think Auburn and Michigan State both discovered that in different ways. An Auburn team that doesn't turn the ball over couldn't hold on to it. A
Right.
Michigan State team that pounds teams into submission on the glass couldn't get a rebound. So yeah, it's young people. They're not pros, not yet. Um, there will be some variability. We talk about these things because we really have no choice, as being based on what they do over the course of a season, and especially at the point we're at now, you believe that that has some validity, and it does for the most part. But you can have weird things happen. More weird things will happen in a college game than will ever happen in an NBA game, you know,
Right.
for obvious reasons. They're less talented, they're less mature. So that all goes without saying. In terms of focus, you know, it's, I know this much. Tom Izzo is going into this is going to be his 11th Elite Eight game. I think this is Bruce Pearl's third.
Mm-hmm.
He's won one and he's lost one, I think. No, it's not like Bruce Pearl's never been here, but he has not been here the way Tom Izzo has.
Right.
And Tom Izzo has his kind of team. None of that guarantees anything. Michigan State go out and lose by 25. But I don't think they will. And the reason I don't think they will is mostly down to that. They have got the best second day prep coach, I think, in college basketball in tournament history. Uh, they have a method and an approach that is proven over time to produce good results. Not every time, but most of the time. And
Mm-hmm.
when he's got a team like this one that is dialed into what he wants, pretty safe. Pretty safe to assume that they're going to come out and they're going to have a chance to win this game because of all those things. I can't speak to where Auburn's going to be. I
Right.
I can understand the feeling that you're talking about when you see a team come out in a huge game and just kind of drift and half-ass it for 30 minutes. You don't feel great about that. But on the other hand, they won the game and they ended
Right.
up winning it in impressive fashion. They dominated the last 10 minutes. And Christ, we talk about that as a positive for Michigan State all the time, right?
Right.
So you got to give Auburn credit for doing that. I guess I would put it this way. I'm reasonably certain of what we're going to see in terms of effort and focus from Michigan State. I am far less certain what we see in those departments from Auburn. And because of that, it it makes it a game. If the focus and the execution is exactly the same from both teams, I would say that probably means Auburn wins. Because I think, this is a really experienced team. I mean, you look at how many I talked about, what's his name,
Yeah.
Baker Mazzara being 90. Um, they've just got guys that are in their early and mid 20s everywhere.
Yeah.
A bunch of fifth year guys. I think they got 3 guys in their 7-man rotation that are, or maybe it's 4 in their 8-man rotation that are fifth year players. Michigan State is not a young team, but they don't have that.
Yeah.
So, who knows? But I think, again, I think if all else being equal, Auburn is a little more mature and across the board, probably you'd say more skilled than Michigan State, at least the way this Michigan State team has played in terms of shooting, right?
Yeah.
Um, but there's no guarantee that they're going to be the same in those ways, in execution and focus. And as I say, I feel pretty good about Michigan State's chances in that way. I just don't know what we're going to see from Auburn. That to me is the question. If Auburn is like a B and Michigan State's an A, Michigan State's going to win. I'm
Well,
convinced
I
of
was
that.
just, and you to that point, if you
I
look
don't
back
think
at the three,
Auburn needs to be terrible for
right,
Michigan
for
State to
Michigan
win.
State, right? They don't need
Absolutely
to
not.
like, yeah, not
I
like we're
heard
not playing
that's
the
one more line. I heard that dope Jeff Goodman make a comment last night when I tortured myself by watching that piece of shit show, um, saying that the Auburn Michigan State game looked a lot to him like the majors versus a double A team. Are you out of your mind? This is what I mean by guys not even being equipped to talk about what they're watching because they don't understand what they're watching. The idea that you think Michigan State looks like a double A team by comparison to Auburn, you're insane. This does not take Auburn coming out. We've seen tournament games in the past where you legitimately had reason to think, hey, probably need that team to give a C plus kind of effort to have a
yeah,
really good shot at winning, and then we'd need to be really good.
North
This isn't
Carolina.
one of those.
Yeah, right.
It's not.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens, I guess, for Michigan State. I think, and the thing I would say for the three games so far this tournament, I don't feel like Michigan State's come even close to playing a very good game, like a great game. I mean, I think in
100%
aspects of it, they've
agree.
been pretty good,
100% agree.
but they've played much better games this season. And even then, I mean, they have certainly haven't put two halves together. Now you could argue that, well, since they haven't put two halves together for a long time, maybe they're just never going to put two halves together, which I think is a reasonable argument. But
Yeah,
I don't,
but
this team
I
has the
think
potential. Is there this? You know what? I'll use a term. I think the ceiling is pretty high still for this team, and they have yet to come close to it.
what if they do everything they've done during the course of the year. So, not asking for anything out of the ordinary in terms of their
Right.
rebounding, their defense, getting to the free throw line, making free throws, but they're also 7 for 16 from 3. What happens then? And do you say that's a 0% chance of happening? No. It's better than that.
Yeah.
Uh there's I think you're right. Of course, I think you're right. The ceiling has not been touched yet for this team. And generally speaking, when we've seen this team challenged, they've responded. So that's why I think I have confidence in the idea that Michigan State's going to come out and play well tomorrow. I feel pretty good about the chances of that happening. I'm less certain about what we see from the other side. And so it's always about putting those two elements together and
Right.
seeing what you get. you know? Like I think yesterday, honestly, it was far from a perfect game, but I think in totality, you would look at that game and say that was reasonably well played by both teams, by Michigan State and Ole Miss. I think that's a fair statement, you know? Not
Hmm.
perfectly, execution wasn't perfect, but reasonably well played. Michigan State in a game where both teams played pretty well, Michigan State's a better team. If that same equation happens tomorrow, probably Auburn wins. But if Auburn's just good, just okay, eh, I think Michigan State wins if they're playing well. I know they do.
Yeah.
The idea that this is a majors to double A gap is ludicrous. It's insane. It tells me that you don't understand what you're watching and you really shouldn't be talking about the sport. So
And yet,
if
yeah, you don't watch
anybody
our
wants
show and
to
you've listened to watch his. I don't know.
if anybody
It's
wants to help, continue to harass me, send harassing messages to our account insisting that I stop listening and watching to the Field of 68 for my mental health and to make sure you don't have to hear me ranting about what a moron Jeff Goodman is.
all right. Well, we're going to leave it there. And we'll be back almost for sure live right after the game, hopefully with another Michigan State win and a ninth trip to the Final Four for Tom Izzo and the crew. So until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go green.